Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The proposal came like a thief in the night, unannounced, unsettling, yet oddly dressed in celebration. Sarah had always considered herself a woman of steady footing. Her thoughts were measured, her routines crisp, and her days at Prime Tech Holdings flowed like an orchestra she alone conducted. So when Ken dropped to one knee in the middle of the staff lounge, under flickering fluorescent lights and the stale scent of office coffee, she was paralyzed in place. The world around her roared with excitement, clapping, phones recording, hands covering surprised mouths, but all Sarah could hear was the sound of her own pulse thudding like an old drum. She said yes, because what else could she say when 30 pairs of eyes watched her mouth for an answer? Ken smiled wide, triumphant like a man who had just planted a flag, but Sarah's own smile trembled at the edges. That night, while the congratulatory texts rolled in and Rose called screaming with joy, Sarah stood by her bedroom window, holding her engagement ring up to the moonlight. It sparkled like promises tend to, bright but hollow. She whispered under her breath, not to herself, but to the silence, "Is this what I want? Or is this what everyone wants for me?" She didn't know. But love has a way of blinding the eyes before it hardens the heart. The days that followed moved like molasses, sweet on the outside, heavy within. In the office, Rhonda's voice drifted toward Sarah like smoke from a distant fire. "You know two partners can't work in the same department, right?" she had said, her lips barely hiding the smirk underneath. Sarah's chest sank like a canoe, with a tiny puncture, slow but inevitable. That evening, over a dinner of boiled yam and stew, she asked Ken gently, like one handling glass, "What do we do about work? One of us will have to resign." Ken didn't look up from his plate. "It won't be me," he said flatly. "I'll be the head of this family. That's my responsibility." The words were sharp as unwashed blades. Sarah felt them cut into her chest, silent and unseen. "But I love what I do," she murmured. Ken finally looked at her, but his eyes didn't soften. "Then love me more." That night, Sarah walked to her aunt's house in the next estate, dragging her feet like someone going to bury a friend. Auntie Mara listened, her eyes narrowed, her arms folded, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the finality of thunder. "You're the woman, Sarah. It's your duty to build peace. You can always find another job, but you can't find another husband every day." Sarah nodded, but her soul groaned. Inside her, something began to wilt. Like the fig tree in Mark 11 that bore no fruit, she wondered if she too would be cursed for not blooming where others had planted her without permission. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She watched the ceiling until dawn, then dressed without touching breakfast and waited. By afternoon, her best friend Rose arrived, breezing in with bags of jollof rice and plantain, oblivious to the storm waiting in Sarah's chest. "If you were in my shoes," Sarah asked as they ate, "would you quit your job for love?" Rose froze mid-bite, her eyes searching Sarah's for more than the question. "Unless the man is truly worth it," she said slowly, "I wouldn't." But Sarah needed Ken to be worth it. She clung to the memory of his gentleness in their early days, the way he once held her hand like it was a scripture, the way he spoke her name as though it were sacred. "He promised to start a business for me," Sarah added, her voice too quiet to be confident. And so, the next Monday, she walked into HR with her resignation letter tucked under her arm. The corridors felt longer than usual, the elevator slower. She smiled as she handed it over, and even though her mouth moved, her heart didn't follow. That evening, Ken took her out for dinner and toasted to new beginnings, but Sarah could already feel something slipping through her fingers. Her freedom, perhaps. Her rhythm. Herself. At first, things looked promising. Ken bought her a new notebook and told her to sketch out her business ideas. Sarah, ever diligent, did just that, filling pages with numbers, plans, and names. But weeks turned to months, and the notebook began to gather dust on the console. Ken stopped asking about it. He'd come home tired, distracted, sometimes not at all until dawn. Sarah began to fill her days with idle rituals, washing already clean plates, rearranging furniture that didn't need shifting, sitting by the window and watching clouds go by like old friends. When she brought it up one day, how idle she felt, how forgotten, Ken laughed. "You want to be busy? Start a family. That's work enough." The way he dismissed her dreams felt like watching a house collapse brick by brick, and no one noticed. Still, she tried. She prayed. She opened to Psalms 13 every night. "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever?" And still no answers. Only silence. The kind that stretches like an old wound, aching in places too deep for words. The days at home began to form a strange pattern. Quiet mornings filled with the soft hum of a standing fan, afternoons marked by the echo of her own footsteps, and evenings that felt like a question no one wanted to answer. Sarah started waking up before the sun, not because she had something urgent to do, but because she couldn't stand the idea of sleeping too long into the loneliness. Ken's alarm still went off at 5:30 a.m., and he dressed with the same confidence he'd always worn like a badge, his cologne filling the room before he ever said good morning. She often watched him from the bed, his back to her, moving like a man already living in a different house. When he left, the silence returned like an unwelcome visitor. Sarah would sit on the edge of the bed for long minutes, the notebook he'd once gifted her still closed on the dresser. She tried opening it once, tried to write down new business plans, but the words refused to come. It was as though her ideas had grown legs and fled when her voice began to shrink. The neighbors' generators sometimes filled the compound with noise, but inside their flat, there was stillness, unshaken, unkind. When the fridge hummed or the kettle whistled, it startled her. She had become a stranger to her own breath. Days bled into each other like watercolor on wet paper, and still, Ken never asked what she was doing with her time. Not once. One rainy Tuesday, while folding already folded laundry, Sarah heard laughter coming from the front balcony. She peeped through the curtain and saw Ken standing under the shelter, phone to his ear, grinning in a way she hadn't seen in months. It wasn't the smile he gave her when he remembered to. This one was different. It stretched across his face like sunrise over calm waters, effortless and full. She moved away from the curtain, her heart pounding. Something in her already knew. She returned to the laundry basket, pressing towels with a precision that made her look busy, even though her thoughts were unraveling like loose thread from the hem of a blouse. That night, Ken came in smelling of rain and grilled suya. He didn't bring any for her. He didn't even mention dinner. Instead, he walked past her where she stood at the kitchen sink, his phone glued to his hand, his smile still lingering. "You're quiet these days," he muttered while changing clothes. "Hope you're not sick." Sarah wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. How could someone miss the sickness when they were the very reason for it? Instead, she replied, "I'm fine," even though every bone in her body felt like it was bending beneath the weight of unspoken words. That night, she lay beside him in bed, eyes wide open, and whispered into the dark, "A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones." It was Proverbs 17, verse 22, and it tasted like truth on her tongue. She didn't tell Rose. Not yet. It wasn't shame that held her back. It was the fear that saying it aloud would make it more real. But the signs were there, like poorly hidden stains on white fabric. Ken came home later than usual, sometimes with excuses, sometimes with silence. He no longer asked how she spent her day, no longer touched her shoulder in passing, no longer listened to her hum while she cooked. The space between them grew into a canyon, deep and uncrossed. One evening, as she arranged old photo albums on the floor, an attempt to reconnect with herself, she came across a picture from their dating days. Ken had his arm around her, and they both looked carefree, young, and loud with joy. She traced her finger over the photo and felt a lump swell in her throat. Was it all a mirage? A shadow dressed like substance? She opened her Bible with trembling hands, flipping until her eyes landed on Jeremiah 17, verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? The scripture stung like salt in a fresh wound. She wanted to believe Ken had simply changed under pressure, that marriage had revealed cracks they were never trained to fix. But part of her feared that the man she married had never really existed. He was a performance, and she had paid the ticket with her own peace. One night she found herself outside, sitting on the front steps long after the rest of the compound had gone to sleep. The moon lit the compound in silver patches, and the air carried the faint smell of wet sand. She held a cup of lukewarm tea she hadn't touched and stared into the night like it owed her an answer. That's when she heard it, the soft buzz of Ken's phone vibrating on the living room table. He was in the shower. Something pushed her to pick it up. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was the final thread of self-respect tying itself into a knot. She didn't even check the screen before answering. "Hello?" she said quietly. On the other end, a woman's voice, clear, confident, and unbothered, spoke without hesitation. "Please give the father of my son the phone." For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. The words didn't just sting. They exploded in her chest, turning years of sacrifice into ashes. She looked at the door of the bathroom, then at the phone, and something in her snapped, not loudly, but cleanly, like a twig breaking in a forest too quiet to notice. She dropped the phone on the table and walked to the bedroom. Her hands shook, but her spine was steel. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't crying. She was remembering who she was, where she'd come from, and why silence was never the answer. Her breath steadied as she whispered to herself, "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." Psalm 91, verse 1. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew it wouldn't be this. The following morning, Sarah rose with a silence that wasn't empty, but calculating. The sun had barely stretched its fingers across the compound when she began moving through the house like someone on the edge of clarity. She wasn't frantic. She wasn't bitter. She was still, unsettlingly so. The kind of stillness you see in the moments before a dam breaks. Ken was already gone by then, having left earlier than usual, not even offering his routine, half-hearted "see you later." Sarah didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. She sat at the dining table, a glass of untouched water before her, and stared into nothing. The words from the night before echoed in her mind like a bell struck too hard. "Give the father of my son the phone." There was no mistake, no room for doubt. Rhonda's voice had been too familiar, too relaxed, too sure of her place, a place that Sarah, for all her bending and breaking, had never truly occupied. She began to remember the little things now, the way Ken had started locking his phone screen with a fingerprint, the business trips that were never mentioned until the night before, the sudden increase in his generosity towards himself, and the sudden lack of interest in hers. She saw it all now, not through the lens of a wife desperate to believe, but as a woman who had swallowed too much and finally felt it clawing its way back up. She wasn't ready to tell anyone yet. Not her aunt. Not even Rose. What she needed now wasn't a rescue. It was resolve. The rest of the day passed like a funeral procession in her chest. She bathed, dressed, and tidied the house as she always did, but everything felt ceremonial, as though she were preparing to leave a life she'd already mentally buried. Each item she touched, the curtains she straightened, the throw pillows she plumped, the mug she washed for the third time, felt like a relic from another era. Her body moved by memory, but her mind was elsewhere, weaving plans with trembling but determined fingers. Around mid-afternoon, she picked up her phone and scrolled through her contact list until she reached Rose's name. Her thumb hovered, but she didn't press dial. Not yet. She knew Rose would come with fire in her voice, with questions and outrage and possibly tears. But Sarah didn't want tears anymore. She was done being the one everyone pitied. What she wanted now was air, a clean, long breath of it, outside this house that had slowly turned into a cage with velvet bars. So she took a walk, just around the estate, just enough to remember that the world still moved beyond these walls. Children were playing in the compound, their laughter rising and falling like an old hymn. An older woman swept her corridor with rhythmic strokes. A young man passed by blasting music from his phone. Life continued. Somehow, it always did. And as Sarah walked, she repeated softly under her breath, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." Psalm 30, verse 5. Whether that morning had come, she didn't yet know, but she was looking for it. When Rose eventually came that evening, uninvited, holding a nylon bag of roasted plantain and groundnuts, Sarah opened the door with a straight face but eyes that carried 1,000 storms. Rose, always intuitive, knew better than to start with questions. She placed the bag on the dining table and sat, removing her sandals with a sigh. "You've lost weight," she said finally, not accusing, not overly emotional, just stating it like one would point out the weather. Sarah didn't respond. She sat across from her and opened her palms on the table, a gesture of surrender, of revelation. "He has a child with Rhonda," she said plainly, as though announcing the outcome of a sports match. Rose's lips parted, but no words came. She blinked several times, her mouth opening, closing. Then finally she asked, "You're sure?" Sarah nodded, then told her about the phone call. Rose leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing slowly over her chest, like someone bracing for impact. "That bastard," she muttered. "I introduced you to him. I should have known." Sarah shook her head. "Don't do that. You didn't know. And even if you did, I made my choice. I loved him." Rose was silent for a long time, then said, "And now?" Sarah looked toward the kitchen window, where dusk was beginning to settle like a slow prayer. "Now I love me more." Rose reached out and took her hand. "So what do we do?" Sarah squeezed her fingers. "We pack. I'm leaving." It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. But it was the kind of declaration that comes after a storm has passed and the soil begins to breathe again. By the time Ken came home that night, Sarah had already packed 2 suitcases and kept them by the bedroom wall. She didn't yell. She didn't wait to confront him in a flurry of accusations. Instead, she sat in the living room, legs crossed, phone in hand, fully dressed and composed like someone waiting for a cab, not a confrontation. Ken walked in whistling, paused when he saw her, and gave her a confused half-smile. "You going somewhere?" he asked, walking towards the fridge. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Yes." He opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water, drank, then leaned against the counter. "Work stuff?" She stood. "No. Life stuff." He blinked, sensing something unfamiliar in her tone. "Sarah, what's going on?" She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I know. About Rhonda. About the child." He lowered the bottle slowly. The silence that followed wasn't filled with denial. It was filled with a different kind of fear. The fear of a man who had finally been found out by someone too tired to shout. "I can explain," he said. "No need," Sarah replied. "The math is clear. 1 + 1 makes 3. And I'm not the third." Ken stepped forward. "Wait, Sarah, let's talk." "Don't do this." She took her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and said, "I already did. 4 months. You just weren't listening." She paused at the door, turned back one last time, and whispered, "Better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry man." Proverbs 21, verse 19. And with that she stepped into the night, where the air smelled of freedom. The street outside was quieter than Sarah expected, as though the world itself had paused to mark the moment. She didn't rush. She wheeled her suitcase behind her with the same grace a queen might carry her train, dignified, deliberate. She hadn't planned to leave at night, but something about the darkness felt right. It wrapped around her like a blanket, soft but unyielding. The compound gate creaked behind her as she stepped onto the main road, the hum of distant generators filling the air with an uneven rhythm. She had called Rose 20 minutes before, and as she waited on the curb, she felt the night breeze press gently against her cheek like a mother's palm. It wasn't cold, it was calming. A dog barked somewhere nearby, followed by a baby's distant wail. Life, in all its messy splendor, continued. But for Sarah, something had shifted permanently. She wasn't just leaving a house, she was shedding a season. She heard the tires before she saw the car. Rose's old Toyota pulled up, headlights slicing through the quiet like questions. Sarah opened the back door, placed her bags inside, and entered the front seat. Rose didn't say a word. She just reached out, touched Sarah's hand, and started driving. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was sacred. As they pulled onto the highway, Sarah whispered, "God is within her. She shall not fall. He will help her at break of day." Psalm 46 verse 5. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Rose's apartment was small but warm, cluttered in the way a lived-in space should be. The moment Sarah stepped in, she was greeted by the smell of fried plantain and peppermint soap, two of Rose's favorite things. She removed her shoes, placed her bags by the corner, and stood there for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Rose handed her a soft towel and said, "Breathe first, then bath, then eat." In that order. Sarah nodded, grateful for instructions. In the bathroom, she stood under the shower for what felt like hours. The water wasn't hot, but it was steady, and it beat against her back like the hands of heaven scrubbing off months of sorrow. She didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. But she let the water take what it could. By the time she came out, wrapped in a faded but clean towel, Rose had set a plate of rice and sauce on the table and was flipping through TV stations like someone trying not to watch the news of her own life. They ate mostly in silence, occasionally commenting on some ridiculous commercial or the bad lighting in a soap opera. When the meal was over and the plates rinsed, Sarah finally spoke. "I don't think I'm angry," she said, almost surprised by her own voice. Rose looked at her, waiting. "I think I'm just empty. Like I spent all my words and emotions on a man who saw me as decoration, not destination." Rose leaned back and sighed. "You gave him peace. He turned it into wallpaper. That's not on you." They stayed up late, wrapped in blankets and unspoken forgiveness. It was the first time Sarah felt seen since she'd left Primetech, and though she didn't know what tomorrow held, tonight held safety, and that was enough. The days that followed were slow, but they weren't heavy. Sarah moved like someone relearning how to walk, careful, intentional, and determined not to fall for the same rhythm that had once rocked her to sleep while stealing her identity. Rose had given her the guest room, which doubled as a small storage space, but Sarah didn't mind. The walls were pink, the bed narrow, and the wardrobe barely closed, but it was hers, and it didn't carry the scent of betrayal. She began waking up earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but habit. She'd sweep the tiny corridor, make a pot of tea, and sit on the balcony with her Bible, letting the sunrise warm her skin while she searched for verses that didn't feel like punishment. One morning she read Isaiah 43 verse 2 and closed her eyes. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." It hit her like a wave, not because she doubted God's presence, but because she had forgotten what it meant to feel accompanied. She started journaling again, small thoughts, scattered prayers, ideas for a business she hadn't yet named. The woman who had once lived on boardroom memos and press releases now found joy in writing about how the neighbor's cat always jumped onto the fence at 6 a.m. It was a different life, but it was hers. And every morning, when she brushed her teeth and saw her reflection, no longer dulled by sorrow, she whispered, "You're still in here. You never left." But healing wasn't linear. Some nights came with shadows that wrapped around her ankles and tried to drag her backward. She'd hear a familiar ringtone and freeze, heart thudding. Or a man would walk past wearing Ken's cologne, and she'd be tempted to turn. There were moments she caught herself reaching for her phone, wanting to send him a message, not to return, but to say, "You broke something beautiful." But she never did. Instead, she'd write it in her journal and close the page like sealing a wound. Rose watched her closely during those times, always present but never pressing. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, Sarah sat by the window with her knees drawn to her chest and whispered, "How did I let it get that bad?" Rose didn't answer immediately. She came, sat beside her, and said, "Because you were raised to believe that endurance is love. But it isn't. Love doesn't ask you to shrink." Sarah nodded slowly. She wasn't angry anymore. Not with Ken, not even with herself. She was grieving, not a man, but a version of herself that had died under the weight of silence. And grief, though cruel, was at least honest. As the sky deepened into night, Sarah closed her eyes and prayed, not for revenge, not for justice, but for clarity, for the strength to never again betray herself in the name of loyalty, and for the courage to bloom even in unfamiliar soil. The first morning Sarah left the house alone again. It wasn't with confidence. It was with trembling courage. She wore a plain navy blouse and black jeans, her hair wrapped in a soft scarf that framed her face gently. It was a Wednesday, and the roads were busy with the usual Lagos noise, hawkers shouting prices, kiki riders honking like they were orchestrating a chaotic song, mothers hurrying children across pothole-lined streets. She walked through it all with a gaze that didn't search for anything in particular but soaked in everything. Her destination wasn't far, just a quiet cafe nestled between a barbing salon and a dusty stationery store. She had discovered it the week before during an aimless stroll. Something about the peeling green door and the old jazz playing from a speaker inside had drawn her like a whisper. Today, she returned with her small journal tucked under her arm. The waiter, a young woman with bright eyes and a shy smile, greeted her like an old friend. Sarah took a corner seat by the window and ordered a cup of lemon tea and a slice of pound cake. She didn't bring her phone. She didn't need digital noise today. Instead, she opened her journal and began to write, not about Ken, not about betrayal, but about herself. "Who am I becoming?" she wrote, followed by silence. Then a woman who lost her voice and learned how to sing again without needing a microphone. She sat back, read those words twice, and smiled to herself. Slowly, like a flower sensing sunlight, she was blooming. By the following week, Sarah began volunteering at a nearby bookshop run by a retired teacher named Mama Dia. The shop wasn't profitable, but it was magical. Every shelf leaned slightly, as if the books themselves were tired of being unread. Dust coated the spines like wisdom waiting to be noticed, and the air always smelled faintly of old pages and mint. Sarah found comfort there. She'd dust, arrange, and sometimes just sit behind the counter watching people pass by, her thoughts softer than they'd been in years. Mama Dia, a woman with silver hair and a voice like gentle thunder, didn't ask too many questions. On Sarah's third day, she handed her a flask of tea and simply said, "You have eyes like someone who survived a fire. But don't forget, some fires refine." That night, Sarah opened her Bible again and read Isaiah 61 verse 3. "To give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness." The verse felt like balm. Not everything was healed. Not yet. There were still nights when her mind wandered to the man she once thought would protect her from the world, but ended up being the storm. But now, those thoughts didn't drown her. They passed like heavy clouds that no longer brought rain. The bookshop became her quiet revival. The way some people found God in cathedrals, Sarah was finding him in the silence between shelves, in the stories left behind by strangers, and in the voice inside her that was beginning to sound familiar again. News of her leaving Ken reached her aunt eventually, not through gossip but through Rose, who thought it better the truth came from love than from lips eager to distort. Auntie Mara called one evening while Sarah was helping a child choose between two picture books. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she hesitated before answering. Sarah, the familiar voice said, not with judgment, but with a weighty gentleness. "You didn't say anything. You just disappeared." Sarah stepped outside, leaning against the faded shop wall. "Because I knew you'd tell me to stay. Again." There was a pause long enough to carry regret. "I was wrong," her aunt finally said. "I wanted you to make your marriage work, but I never asked if your spirit was dying inside it." Sarah swallowed hard, eyes closing against the sting of uncried tears. "I thought it was my cross to bear," she murmured, "but even Jesus fell under his and needed help to carry it." Her aunt's voice cracked. "You were never meant to bleed alone." They talked for another hour, about old wounds, failed beliefs, and the quiet cost of womanhood. When the call ended, Sarah felt lighter, not because all was fixed, but because a chapter had been closed with grace instead of silence. That night, as she lay on the narrow guest bed, she whispered Psalm 34, verse 18 into the dark. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." And somehow, that truth wrapped around her tighter than any blanket. It wasn't long before Ken tried to reach her. It started with a text, "We need to talk." She didn't respond. Then came the called, blocked number, but his voice still found her ears. "Sarah, please. Just one conversation. I miss you. I made mistakes." In fact, that was the most confusing part, how she could remember the sound of his laugh and still choose to walk away from it. But she had grown in ways he couldn't access anymore. What he broke, he no longer had the tools to repair. He called again days later. She let it ring. Then came the message that made her laugh out loud, a short and desperate plea. "Rhonda's making my life hell." "I don't know what I was thinking." Sarah didn't reply. Instead, she closed her phone and returned to arranging bookshelves, humming a hymn under her breath. It was Rose who noticed her smile that afternoon and asked, "What's different today?" Sarah shrugged. "Nothing. Everything." They both laughed, and the sound was rich, unforced. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah sat alone on the shop's front steps, watching people pass. She held her journal in one hand, a cup of Zobo in the other. And as she watched the streetlights flicker on, she wrote just one line: "You can survive a fire and still smell like flowers." It wasn't poetry. It was her truth. The rain that morning was soft, barely more than a mist, but it painted the world in silver and made the street glow like something freshly baptized. Sarah stood by the window in Rose's apartment, watching as droplets slid down the glass like quiet reminders that life, no matter how wounded, keeps moving. The smell of a cow frying from a neighbor's kitchen drifted into the room, mingling with the minty scent of her tea. She had no meetings, no deadlines, no rush to be anywhere, but for the first time in years, she felt full. Not because everything was fixed, but because she was no longer pretending. She leaned against the window pane, her forehead gently pressed to the cool glass, and closed her eyes. If someone had told her a year ago that she'd walk away from her marriage with nothing but 2 suitcases and still feel richer than she ever had, she would have laughed. Yet here she was, lighter, wiser, still bruised in some places, but no longer bleeding. Her heart, once stretched thin like thread pulled across too many needles, now sat quietly in her chest, learning to beat in rhythm with peace. She remembered Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1, whispered it to herself, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." She was done mourning. Now was the time to rebuild. Later that day, Rose returned from her errands with a flyer in hand, the corner slightly crumpled from the wind. They're opening applications for the new Women's Entrepreneurial Grant downtown, she said, eyes bright with unspoken suggestions. Sarah took the flyer with cautious fingers, scanning the bold letters and the requirements. It was nothing fancy, just a local initiative trying to support women who wanted to start something meaningful. You should apply, Rose said, sitting on the edge of the couch, already pulling out her phone. I know you've been sketching ideas in that journal of yours. This is your time. Sarah smiled, but it didn't come from habit. It came from a place much deeper. That evening, she stayed up past midnight drafting her proposal. She outlined a small community bookstore, one that would also serve as a reading lounge for young girls in the neighborhood, a place where stories could be found, shared, and lived. It wasn't just about selling books. It was about rebuilding dreams in paper and ink. She poured everything into it, her old work ethic, her fresh clarity, her desire to create something that couldn't be taken from her. When she was done, she laid her pen down and looked at her reflection in the dark window. She didn't look like a woman who had escaped. She looked like a woman who had emerged. She turned to Psalm 126 verse 5 and whispered it like a vow. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. 2 weeks later, the call came. She had been selected. Her name was one of 10 women listed for the grant award, and her voice trembled when she said thank you over the phone. The ceremony wasn't grand, just a small gathering at a community center with mismatched chairs and cheerful posters. But as she stood at the front to accept her certificate, Sarah felt something rise in her, a confidence that had been sleeping for too long. After the event, a woman approached her. She was young, no more than 23, with large eyes and a hesitant smile. I heard your story, she said quietly. You gave me hope. I'm going through something similar, and I just wanted to say thank you. Sarah nodded, touched her shoulder, and replied, You'll get through it. Just promise me one thing, never let anyone turn your voice into background noise. The girl smiled, and in that moment, Sarah felt the power of shared pain turned into purpose. She wasn't trying to be an inspiration. She was just trying to live. But sometimes that was enough. Later that night, she walked home alone, the certificate tucked under her arm. The stars blinked above like quiet applause, and with each step, she thought of how far she had come. Not in distance, but in strength, in truth, in the return to herself. The world hadn't changed, but she had. And that was the beginning of everything new. Ken called again that weekend. It was late, almost midnight, and Sarah was sitting in her pajamas, sipping tea and reviewing paint samples for her bookstore space. She stared at his name on the screen for a long time before answering. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of all its arrogance. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he began. Not for the cheating, not only for the lying, but for dimming your light. I don't expect you to come back. I just needed you to hear it. Sarah listened, her face calm. You taught me something, she said after a pause. That survival is not the same as living, and I won't trade one prison for another again. He sighed, then said, Rhonda left, took the child. I guess I'm reaping. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't offer comfort either. She simply said, sometimes, when we plant in shadows, we harvest thorns. He was silent, then finally muttered, Take care of yourself, Sarah. She ended the call. No tears. No regrets. Just a steady exhale. She picked up her paint swatches again, settled on a soft coral called Hope Rising, and wrote it down in her journal. That Sunday, she opened to Romans 8 verse 28 and read it aloud. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't just reading it, she was living it. Dear listener, if this story has met you at a crossroads, may you hear this truth loud and clear. Love should not cost you your voice, your joy, or your sense of self. Marriage, relationships, or commitment should never require you to dim your light so someone else can feel taller. If your peace has become a sacrifice laid daily on the altar of silence, It is not love. It is survival dressed in emotional bondage. You are not selfish for choosing healing. You are not broken for walking away from what broke you. And above all, you owe no one your life if they cannot handle your light. Don't stay where you are tolerated when God has created spaces where you are celebrated. Remember, you are not called to endure what is draining you dry. You are called to thrive. So, protect your spirit, honor your voice, and trust that God does not abandon those who choose truth. We thank you for the gift of discernment, for the strength to walk away from what is not aligned with your purpose for our lives. For every listener who feels stuck in places that no longer water their spirit, Lord, release clarity like never before. For the hearts that have been betrayed, comfort them. For the ones who feel forgotten and silenced, restore their voice. Let the healing begin in the quiet places, and let it bloom into confidence, boldness, and purpose. Father, raise up Sarahs in our time, women and men who will choose truth over comfort, peace over performance, and destiny over delay. We declare that no one listening to this prayer will remain in a season that you have ended. Let every spirit of manipulation, emotional stagnation, and false love be uprooted in the name of Jesus. We speak joy into the hearts that have known only mourning. We call forth favor into dry places, and for every listener who has wept in secret, we prophesy that your next chapters shall be filled with open laughter. Lord, teach us to rebuild stronger, wiser, rooted in you. And when the enemy reminds us of who we were, may we boldly respond with who we've become. Because we are chosen, not forsaken. We are vessels of light, not shadows of who we used to be. Thank you, Father, for never leaving us in the fire, but refining us through it. In Jesus' name we pray. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.